In this video, we will begin our examination of the seller's measure of damages in the context where the seller is in possession of the goods and the buyer is in breach. Recall from our earlier discussion of where the buyer has the goods and is in breach. The seller's damages in that context are easy to compute. Under Section 709 1A of Article 2, where the buyer has accepted the seller's goods but has failed to pay the seller is entitled to damages equal to the contract price for the goods, plus the seller's incidental losses stemming from the buyer's breach. And that measure of damages makes sense intuitively if we think about damages from the perspective of protecting the seller's expectation interests. After all, upon acceptance, the buyer is obligated to pay the seller the contract price for the goods. So where the buyer breaches that obligation, then to put the seller in the position she expected to be had the contract been fully performed means that the seller must get paid the contract price for the goods, the price she expected to receive from the buyer under the breached contract. But where the buyer has not accepted and the seller is still in possession of the goods, then the measure of the seller's damages is more complicated. Article 2 contemplates four possibilities for measuring the seller's damages: resale damages under 706, market-based damages under 708 subsection 1, lost profit damages under section 708 subsection 2, and the contract price under section 709. Each of these measures is listed in section 703, the section that lists the seller's remedies generally, and then it's defined by its own separate provision. And each measure of damages is designed to protect the seller's expectation interest in different ways. We'll start with the easiest and move on to the hardest. In this video, we will focus our attention on the two most typical measures of the seller's damages, the two that also happen to be the easiest to understand intuitively: resale damages under 706 and market-based damages under 708 subsection 1. And we will save the less too typical and conceptually more difficult measures of damages for the next video. So let's start with the first, the seller's resale damages under section 706. Conceptually, this should be easy to understand. Where the seller is in possession of the goods and the buyer has breached its contractual obligation to purchase those goods, then pursuant to section 706, the seller may enter into another contract with another buyer to sell those goods, in which case the seller will be entitled to damages equal to the difference between the contract price for those goods under the breached contract, that is the price the seller expected to receive from the breaching buyer, and the resale price, the price at which the seller was able to resell those goods to another buyer. This should all sound very familiar to you. Press pause now and think about it for a moment. What does this resale measure of damages of the seller remind you of? Hopefully you said the buyer's cover damages under section 712 of Article 2. The seller's resale damages under 706 are indeed the seller's analog to the buyer's cover damages under 712. The difference between the contract price and the seller's resale price represents the measure of the seller's direct damages resulting from the buyer's breach. But the seller may also suffer indirect losses, and like the buyer, the seller may recover damages for her incidental losses. The seller's incidental damages are defined under section 710 of Article 2. Speaking broadly, those damages are defined to cover the cost incurred by the seller in coping or dealing with the buyer's breach. Those costs might include things like the seller's cost incurred to reship the goods back to the seller after the buyer wrongfully rejects the goods, or the cost the seller incurs in storing the goods while the seller attempts to find another buyer, while the seller attempts to engage in a resale. Or perhaps, finally, the cost the seller incurs in advertising or marketing the goods to find another buyer. But note, unlike a buyer, a seller is never entitled to consequential damages in the event of the buyer's breach. Regardless of the statutory measure of damages used for the seller, none of those measures provide that the seller is entitled to recover for any consequential losses arising from the buyer's breach. The rationale for omitting consequential damages from the seller's remedies is that a breach by the buyer will seldom implicate the seller's relationship with outside parties. Stated differently, while a seller may well incur incidental losses trying to cope with or limit the harm caused by the buyer's breach, a seller will almost never suffer consequential losses in its dealings with third parties as a result of the buyer's breach. But that does not mean that consequential losses are never recoverable by the seller. Remember, like almost all of the provisions of Article 2, the remedy provisions of Article 2 are only default rules. If the seller anticipates suffering consequential losses in the event of the buyer's breach, the seller can insist on either an express term in the party's contract to make such losses recoverable, or a liquidated damages provision to approximate ex ante the amount of those losses. Coming back to Section 706, 706 says the seller may engage in a resale of the goods and recover resale damages for its direct and incidental losses resulting from the buyer's breach. The section also sets forth some basic rules for how the seller may go about accomplishing any resale of the goods. The seller's failure to comply with these rules will mean that the seller will not be entitled to resale damages under Section 706, but instead some other measure of damages. The rules applicable to resales contemplate that any resale may be at a private sale, that is, an individually negotiated contract between the seller and another buyer, or at a public sale. For example, where applicable, the seller may attempt to resell the goods at an auction or on some kind of commodities exchange. In either case, prior to any private or public resale, the seller must give the breaching buyer reasonable notice of the seller's intention to resell. But the key overriding requirements for any resale by the seller are found in subsections 1 and 2 of Section 706. Under subsection 1, the seller must arrange for any resale in good faith and in a manner that is commercially reasonable. And under subsection 2, the requirement of commercial reasonableness applies to every aspect of the resale, including the seller's manner and method, as well as the time, place, and terms upon which the seller resells the goods. Thus, there is some flexibility for the non-breaching seller in how she goes about reselling the goods, so long as the resale transaction is conducted in good faith and in a commercially reasonable manner. As a practical matter, most sellers will opt to resell the goods where the buyer has breached their contract to purchase those goods. But in some cases, for whatever reason, the seller may not engage in a resale, or the seller may engage in a resale, but one that fails to comply with the rules set forth in Section 706. In either of those scenarios, the seller will not be entitled to resale damages under 706, but may instead seek market-based damages under Section 708, subsection 1 of Article 2. As we just noted, the seller's resale damages under Section 706 are the seller's analog to the buyer's cover remedy. Similarly, the seller's market-based damages under Section 708, subsection 1 are the analog to the buyer's market-based damages under 713. Where the seller does not seek damages based on a resale transaction, Section 708, subsection 1 treats the seller as if she did engage in a resale based on the market price, and it asks what would the seller's damages have been if the seller had attempted to resell the goods. In this case, the seller is entitled to damages equal to the difference between the contract price for the goods under the breached contract, that is the price the seller expected to receive from the breaching buyer, and the market price for the goods, that is the price the seller could have received had the seller engaged in a resale, plus again any incidental damages. Note that under Section 708, subsection 1, the market price is based on the price at the time and place of tender. So it becomes important to ascertain the parties' contract terms regarding the time and place where tender was due. And in the absence of any express contract terms, we would need to look to the UCC's statutory gap filler rules as to where and when tender is to take place. One final note about the seller's damages, where the buyer breaches, and how it compares to the buyer's damages in the event the seller breaches. Recall that where the seller breaches and the buyer covers, the buyer who covers is barred from seeking market-based damages. The UCC explicitly says this in Section 713, Official Comment Number 5. But the same principle is not necessarily true for a seller where the buyer breaches. Where the buyer breaches and the seller resells, the UCC does not explicitly say whether the seller can select between resale damages under Section 706 or market-based damages under Section 708, subsection 1. The only thing the UCC says about the seller's choice in a remedy is in Comment 2 to Section 706, which simply says the seller's failure to comply with the requirements of a resale transaction under 706 means the seller is only entitled to market-based damages. But nothing in the UCC suggests the opposite is true for the seller. Nothing in the UCC says that when the seller makes a valid resale transaction pursuant to 706, the seller is barred from seeking market-based damages under 708 instead. The negative implication of that omission is that the seller is in fact not barred. Stated differently, the implication is that, unlike a buyer who covers and is therefore precluded from seeking market-based damages, a seller who resells may choose between either resale damages under 706 or market-based damages under 708, subsection 1. Note, This issue is not important in most cases. In most cases, the resale price will be the same as or compelling evidence of the market price. That is true because, remember, resale damages are only available where the resale transaction is undertaken in a manner that is commercially reasonable in all respects. So, under either measure, the seller's damages will in most cases be the same. But it can make a difference where the market price for the goods is volatile, and therefore the market price at the time and place of tender may be substantially different than the price the seller is able to obtain upon a valid resale. So that takes care of the seller's damages in the most typical scenarios. Recall that in this video we covered two alternative measures of the seller's damages where the seller has the goods and the buyer has breached: resale damages under 706 and market-based damages under 708 subsection 1. In the next video, which will also be our last video for this course, we will conclude by examining the less typical and more conceptually difficult measure of the seller's damages where the buyer breaches.